Hi, hello, and welcome to session 2, Developing Vaccines of this pandemics conference. We are fortunate to have in this session 3 great speakers. I will be the moderator. My name is Adolfo García Sastre, and I'm professor of microbiology and director of the Global Health and Emerging Pathogens Institute in Mount Sinai, New York, where I'm located. Each speaker will have 70 minutes, followed by 7 minutes questions that you can put in the website, and I will try to address them, the ones that till we have time. And I don't want to take more time from the speakers, so the first speaker is Mariano Esteban, Dr. Mariano Esteban, which is head of Pox Virus and Vaccines Group at the Center of National Biotechnology in Spain. Mariano, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is a great pleasure to address some particular disease which concerns the COVID-19 and how we are preparing for the future. And always we learn from history what happened to previous pandemics and why we have those and how we can cope with the different diseases. So in retrospect, if we go to variola, which is the smallpox disease that we suffered for centuries all over humanity, it was one of the most deadly diseases. And we really, in the 20th century, caused above 300 million deaths. And it was not until Edward Jenner developed a vaccine that we, in the 20th century, in the 60s, through a WHO global vaccination program, that, as you can see, the disease really disappear from this planet, and then we completely control this deadly viral disease. And this was because we have a vaccine and because the virus only reservoir was the human. So thanks to this, we have to now to cope with many viral diseases or many bacterial diseases, which some of those are very lethal for humans. And WHO considers a number of those. I'm not going to describe all of those, but we have mostly respiratory diseases, hemorrhagic diseases, for which we don't have vaccines in many cases. And then the problem is also due to the zoonotic reservoir, in which animals, they participate in this by transmitting disease from animal to humans, and then there are arthropod-borne viruses that participate in this zoonotic transmission. So, and we have different viruses that we know that are causing diseases. One of those pandemics, which was appearing.
Mariano, I think you are not sharing the screen. You probably have a PowerPoint presentation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you need to share the screen. We cannot see the presentation. We follow you very well, but we are not seeing the presentation.
But I don't understand why.
So are you sharing the screen?
Yeah, because I have the presentation from the beginning.
And in the Zoom, can you check whether you can see sharing the screen?
Because I have in my screen, and then I just gave it to for the presentation.
So you just gave it, but you are not sharing your screen. You think that someone else would be sharing the screen
because of the organizers. Because I gave it to them.
So can I have some help here from Pilar or from someone?
I don't understand. Because I gave it to them. So
okay, Yeah, no, it's not showing that. So you are in the screen, the Zoom, right? Can you look down where you can see share screen and perhaps put your presentation in your computer?
I see.
So down, if you go down in the Zoom, you will see participants, chat, share screen with the pointer. Just go with the pointer down.
Let me I finalize the presentation. Let me try again.
And if you share a screen, then you can put the presentation in your computer.
But compartir, I gave it to compartir and open compartir.
Okay, now we see something.
Okay, you see the whole presentation?
Now we see it. Okay, now we are fine. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about it.
I was referring to one of the most deadly diseases, which was smallpox. And it was not until, let me see. So it was not until the WHO launched a worldwide vaccination campaign that we got to control and to eradicate this disease. It was just declared in 1980 by WHO that we have eradicated this deadly disease, which caused over 300 million deaths in the 20th century. So fortunately, we have a vaccine, but there are many diseases which are caused by microorganisms, mostly viruses and bacteria, and mostly those which are respiratory diseases and hemorrhagic, for which we don't have vaccines. So, and also the animals act as a reservoir, and we have a problem with zoonotic transmission. And many viruses have been just identified, but some of those are causing pandemics, like the HIV virus that in 1981 appeared, and we have up to date. We don't have a vaccine. We don't have vaccines for many other viruses. And then HIV, for example, is still causing about 700 deaths yearly. So, and then in 2019 appears SARS, and SARS, because the scientific community was prepared from previous viral diseases, so we developed very rapidly vaccine candidates. And because we knew the biology of those viruses, and also to target the antigen. And we also understand how viruses transmit and how viruses progress. And what we have is to control the different stages of viral replication, which affect the initial input entry of the virus, and then how the virus spreads through the organism and causes pulmonary diseases like a coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, and how we can prevent. And for that, we need three main tools, which according to WHO, rapid diagnostic tests, antivirals, and effective vaccines. What we have accomplished. First, diagnostic tests were rapidly developed, antivirals not. We still have a problem with the antivirals, but we have developed effective vaccines. And antivirals against the virus have been developed against HIV, for example, very effective, and against hepatitis C, but against SARS-CoV-2, they are intensive work, but still we don't have a specific antivirus that target the virus to various compartments. And this is because we know that to develop an antiviral takes years. However, for vaccines, we knew the genome of the virus, and we knew what to target, which was mostly the protein component, which is outside of the virus particle. We knew the structure of this component. We knew that what role it plays binding to the cell, a specific receptor, that we know how it binds to the receptor to angiotensin converting enzyme, which is the receptor for the entry of the virus, and we knew how to develop vaccines. So vaccines were rapidly developed. mRNA vaccines, very simple, and been developed very rapidly. We also understood how to encapsulate the mRNA into a nanoparticle, which was a very major effort and one of the major achievements in vaccine development. And also we developed other non-replicating virus like adenovirus expressing the coronavirus antigens. And in my lab, we develop also in other labs a pox virus vector, which also express antigens. But how SARS-CoV-2 antigens? But how these vaccines work? Basically, once you deliver the vaccine, the input, the mRNA or the non-replicating virus, they produce the corresponding antigen, the protein. This can also is produced during a limited time. So in our case, for example, non-replicating virus, they produce only within 48 hours. And that is a time sufficient to activate the immune system, where what is basically done is that the viral antigen is produced internally the cell and then is processed and then activates as antigen presenting cells, the two branches of the immune system, both a B cell to produce antibodies and T cells that eventually they target the expressing cell and destroy. So basically in all vaccines, there are three main requirements. One is to produce antibodies that can be are directed specifically to the viral antigen, in this case the S component, the spike. They can produce neutralizing antibodies, which neutralize the virus by binding to the external protein component and blocking its interaction with the receptor. And the third component is to activate the T cells, the two most important T cell population, which are called CD4 and the CD8, and then these vaccines also fulfill that requirement. They activate those cells. But also the critical issue is protection. Do these vaccines protect against viral infection? And this we have to do in BSL-3 laboratories where we have a confinement and we can manipulate the virus and to do the test in animal models, whether mice, hamster or monkeys. And this is something we do here in Spain, in Valdeolmos, and this is my colleagues from the lab, Juan García and Carmen Zamora. And basically what you achieve is with these vaccines is that in animals which are not vaccinated, they die very rapidly after infection, and animals, they lose weight. And those animals that are vaccinated, whether with one dose, they lose some weight, but they recover. And with two doses, spaced 1 month apart, they are fully recovered and they are protected. So, and this is achieved because we eliminate completely the virus. So in the lung, for example, in this case, well, lungs from vaccinated animals, virus is completely eliminated. And we also see this in the lungs that they are just in the healthy, so they are free of virus, and those lungs from control animals are inflamed, and there are many cells of the immune system which are recruited to the lungs. So eventually we achieve in this with the goal to control SARS-CoV-2 is that we have very effective vaccines that they are from 70 to 95% efficacy, which is incredible in the vaccine field from all the times that vaccines have been developed. But viruses develop resistance, obviously, whether against drugs or whether against also trying to overcome antibodies, neutralizing antibodies and T cells. So this is done by introducing mutations, and we have a number of variants which are called alpha, delta, beta, lambda, gamma, etc. And what we know is, for example, with the serum that is produced in those animals or humans, we have neutralizing capacity against different variants of concern, which is important in vaccines. Some variants are more resistant, but eventually we achieve that goal. So what are the questions? So the most important part in which we achieve is strategies and vaccines that block pandemics, as we have seen for variola, smallpox, and also vaccines that we can control SARS-CoV-2. Those different platforms have been approved in the USA and Europe for mRNA and non-replicating vectors. And the technology of mRNA has revolutionized vaccine development. But it remains to be defined the durability of protection and the need for periodic boosters. The appearance of variants of concern represent a global problem if current vaccines are not able to control. And the use of combined vaccines might provide longer-term protection. And the coverage of vaccination should be universal. In Spain, we hope to have vaccinated the majority of the population at the end of this year. And eventually, what we need is surveillance. We have to see that viruses cannot really be easily transmittable to humans and cause diseases. We have a problem with the destruction of biodiversity, which increases the chances to be new viral variants. Climate change is causing also a big problem, deforestation, the anti-drug resistance, and vaccine preparedness. So with all, I think that we can cover and we have to be prepared to really address the issue of new viruses and new diseases, which can cause devastating effects, as we have seen through the SARS-CoV-2 COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you, and also the people from my lab and the organizers and the funding agency which provide support for our research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariano. Thank you to get on time despite the rough beginning. So we open questions now. I have already one question here from the audience. The question is, have SARS-CoV-2 variants developed mutations clearly related to pressure from the vaccine response? So are the mutations that we are seeing being selected, trying to evade pre-existing immunity due to vaccination, or they are due to something else?
Well, we know the viruses, I mean, as you grow the virus always emerge some variants. It's a natural process of viruses. If they encounter resistance, whether it's due to an antiviral drug or whether it's due to neutralizing antibodies, so viruses will defend themselves. So they try to avoid that, and by introducing mutations throughout their replication cycle. So this is a dynamic process that all agents that counteract the virus try to resist by introducing mutation, whether by vaccines or by other means.
Yeah, but I wonder, I think that the question is more about whether the variants that they are right now, they have emerged because of antibody pressure or because something else that makes them more transmissible, and at the same time,
I think that
or we don't know.
Both contribute. I think they both contribute to that.
Both contribute. Okay, fine. I have another question here from Narcis Saubi. Do you think that low duration of vaccine-induced protection is due to vaccine vector or to the nature of SARS-CoV-2? So why we are declining the antibodies so quickly? I guess that's the question. And whether the boosters will actually maintain it, or will also after the boosters start to be declined the same?
Well, I think that all vaccines, I think as you introduce vaccines, so the immune system reacts, and then you produce, in the case of antibodies, so it's something that appears within 10, 15 days. So you have the largest peak of antibodies being produced. And then there is a gradual decline because the cells, you don't have to, the B cells continuously producing. So there is a natural control of the also B and T cells. So there is a decline with time. But the critical issue is that memory B cells or CD4 and CD8 T cells persist. And once those cells see the antigen being by a new infection, they immediately start proliferating and producing more antibodies and more T cell proliferation. So I think this is the key issue. What will be the capacity of the immunized and vaccinated person to respond to the viral infection in an efficient way that trigger higher levels of neutralizing and higher levels of T cells. So that's the way, the important way. It's not to see that because you have a decline, you have to boost it continuously, because that it will not be a good thing after a long run.
Yeah, and I have also a question related to that, the T cells of the vaccine induced by vaccination. They induce T cells, but is there already any mutations in the virus that evade T cell immunity that are known or not?
Whether there is a mutation
for avoiding T cells.
Well, I think that I don't think we know enough to say that the T cells, because usually mutations are more rare to avoid the T cell response. So because of the number of epitopes which can be activating the T cell response. So I think that, again, I guess the T cells are more responsive, and we need those T cells to be activated.
Okay, thank you. And I have a question, actually, which is more generic and goes to pox viruses. So what do you think are the chances that the next pandemic is a pox virus vaccine? And are we ready? Will MVA be a good vaccine against, I don't know, monkeypox if it starts to be transmissible in humans?
Well, we know that MVA is very effective against monkeypox, and also it was used during the eradication campaign against smallpox. And monkeypox are affecting also, there are several thousand deaths a year, so which it has been reported. So, and I'm a member of the WHO Advisory Committee on smallpox, and we meet regularly every year. And the question is that we have to be prepared also if smallpox will reappear, because we are able to synthesize now. We have the technology to rescue, as you did with the Spanish flu, 1918. So that is something that we have to be prepared, just to have those three main parts that I mentioned: quick diagnostic tools, antivirals, and vaccines that we have, fortunately, to cope with that.
Okay, thank you, Mariano. With that note, then we are going to go for our next speaker. Thanks a lot, Mariano.
Thank you, Adolfo. Thanks a lot. Ciao.
And ciao. Our next speaker is going to be Clarissa Simas, which is research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine at University of London in the UK. Clarissa, you just start sharing a screen, then we can look to your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction, Adolfo. Just to confirm that everyone can see my slides okay?
It is fine.
It is fine. Okay, brilliant. So yeah, thank you, Mariano, for such a great and interesting presentation. And today I'm here to talk about vaccine confidence, public attitudes towards it, and why it matters. So this is a session about the development of vaccines, and it's amazing that we have so many being produced, and it's definitely one of the cornerstones of public health. And today I want to make the point that building vaccine confidence, it is very important to have that when you roll out those vaccines. So the vaccines save lives, but only when people take them. So today I'm going to discuss a little the anti-vaccination mistrust, anti-vaccination movements, what is the vaccine confidence gap, and why it's so important to close that and try to address that. So what is vaccine hesitancy? Especially now with the COVID-19 pandemic, the conversation has completely gone mainstream, and everyone has been talking about it. And also the effects that anti-vaccination, the negative effects that anti-vaccination sentiments and groups can have, it's widely assumed now. So I thought I'd start with a textbook definition of what is vaccine hesitancy. So according to the SAGE working group, vaccine hesitancy refers to the delay in acceptance or refusal of vaccination, despite you having those services available to you. So it is complex, it is context specific, it varies across time, place, and vaccines. And I wanna draw your attention to the last line. So if you have confidence in a certain vaccine, it doesn't mean it's always gonna stay like that. And the opposite is also true. So if you have a population that's hesitant about a certain vaccine, you can actually do things that are going to build confidence and actually draw people to vaccinate. And the thing is, the anti-vaccination sentiments, they are as old as vaccine themselves. So this is a satirical print from the 19th century, and it was made by the Anti-Vaccination League. So yeah, there was already an Anti-Vaccination League at the time. And this was a time when the smallpox vaccination was becoming widespread. And in the middle of the image, you have Edward Jenner vaccinating people. And at that time, people were concerned that they would grow animal parts if they took the vaccine. And that was because of the close correlation with cowpox. So this is just an example to say that it's not a new phenomenon. It's something that has always been around. And that is also one of the reasons why it's so important to keep an eye out for it and make sure that it doesn't take over the success of vaccination programs or campaigns. And at the time, the opposition to vaccines, they had four main pillars. So first, there was a resistance to compulsory vaccination. As I said, it was becoming widespread and it was becoming mandatory as well. The principles of the vaccines were not that well understood. So the idea that you could grow cow parts by taking the vaccine. There were religious and philosophical concerns, and also people were not that sure if the vaccines were actually safe or effective. And if we move to 2021, you're going to see that those four pillars, they kind of still exist. So we're all following now the large and very polarizing conversations about making COVID-19 vaccines mandatory or not, vaccination passes, something that's very much in the news, and even among policymakers is something that can be very divisive. The principle of vaccines also remain not that well understood. So with the COVID-19 specifically, there were rumors about microchips, DNA being altered, the possibility of getting infertile from the vaccine. So it shows that that is still there. Of course, there's still religious and philosophical concerns, and none of them are unique to COVID-19 vaccine, and this one isn't either. And we are all living through a pandemic, so I'm sure you came across conversations about safety of a vaccine that has been developed in record time and how effective it actually is. And the thing with vaccine hesitancy is that when we talk about vaccine hesitancy, the first image that comes to mind is the anti-vaxxer, the one that's posting fake news on Facebook and very much actively going against it. But it's actually a continuum, it's actually a spectrum. So in the ends of the spectrum, you have those who refuse all vaccines, those who accept all the vaccines. And in the middle, we have this mass of people that actually fall at different grades of the spectrum. So they might be accepting some vaccines while delaying others. And this is true for the COVID-19 vaccine now. So you have a lot of people that always had vaccines, childhood vaccinations, flu vaccination, and have decided not to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Sometimes you have people that take the vaccine but are still unsure about it, people who refuse and are still unsure about it. So it's important to keep in mind that it's not as black and white as sometimes it seems. It is really a spectrum that you can fall at different places at different times. As I was saying, there's a lot of different dimensions that go into the vaccine decision-making and building vaccine confidence. And we left off when I was showing results from a global study that we conducted. So why does it matter to know the role of trust in vaccine decision-making? So in this global study that we
Somehow you got a mute, Clarissa. Was just 1 second.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
Okay, technology is really angry at us today. Okay, but so carrying on. So showing some results of a global study that we did on maternal vaccine confidence. So again, this was across continents, across different countries. And a key finding was that the most trusted source of information for any decision regarding maternal vaccination were healthcare professionals. But at the same time, if you look at the bar graph, you're going to see that in countries like Italy, Germany, South Africa, France, healthcare professionals were not recommending vaccines or were not giving information about vaccines all that consistently. So here you have a big opportunity being missed because perhaps this was not known or was not made aware. So this is very important to inform health policy that is going to improve vaccine confidence in different places. And I think it's also important to discuss the impact of social and digital media on vaccine confidence. So people say they don't trust the internet, but the fact is that it's not as simple as that. The decisions that we make, and that includes, of course, vaccine decisions, they're not necessarily rational, and we're not fully aware of what is going to influence us when it comes to that. So if someone gets in contact with some anti-vaccination messaging on the internet, it doesn't mean that they're gonna necessarily become anti-vaxxers or fully refuse vaccines. But maybe after watching a few YouTube videos that get recommended to you, or being exposed to misinformation online that kind of looks like it is scientific information, that can work as a tipping point for you to, not for you precisely, but a tipping point for someone who is maybe in the fence still of what they should do regarding vaccination. So here, there are 5 things that it's important to keep in mind in ways that it can actually impact vaccine confidence. As I said, this tipping point, it can work as the global spread of concerns and negative discussions about vaccine can push people towards refusing non-vaccinating stance. The origin and information is also tricky, and sometimes, again, as I said, misinformation can be presented as scientific, and that can trick people. There's a group effect. If you have concerns, you can end up finding people online that share the same concerns, and that's going to reinforce your belief in that. Of course, rumors can stick because they just get circulated and shared so much. And we all have a selection and perception bias. So we tend to look for things that kind of confirm what we already believe or what's already going in our mind. And a new area of research that we're developing at the team is the role of emotions in vaccine decision-making. So Professor Heidi Larson and I were leading a Lancet commission on the emotional determinants of health. So coming back to that idea that our decision-making is not solely rational, we're looking into how emotions such as hope, fear, anxieties, empathy, how they come into play, how they're leveraged when making a decision to vaccinate. So in case I haven't convinced you yet, what are the possible consequences of vaccine hesitancy, and why it is something that we should definitely keep an eye out for and build strategies to tackle? So it can reduce the uptake and increase the occurrence of lethal outbreaks. It can leave entire communities unprotected to diseases that actually could be prevented through vaccine. And ultimately, in more extreme cases, confidence crisis can lead to suspension of vaccination programs. And I think an important example here to cite is the HPV vaccination program in Japan. So due to a confidence crisis in 2013, the program got suspended. The vaccine is still offered in the country, but it's not actively recommended. And of course, that's going to have a big, hefty impact in the burden of disease in the population in that country. So to finalize this talk, I think it would be interesting to show you a few findings from around the world in terms of vaccine confidence. This was a study published in the Lancet. I was one of the first authors that we mapped spatial temporal trends in vaccine confidence around the world. And here are a few of the highlights of this study. So we found that there were significant changes over time. And again, that comes to the idea that it needs to be constantly monitored and constantly dealt with because things can change. We also found that understanding the vaccines as something important to have was a bigger indicator of uptake than finding them safe. So if you think the vaccine is important and it matters to have them, maybe if you're not 100% sure about safety or effectiveness, that can push you to vaccinate. We also found that ethnic minorities and religious minorities, they had lower probability of uptake, and this comes back to the different dimensions of trust. So of course, marginalized communities, they have been excluded from services throughout history. They're not going to be that trusting of vaccines either. And at the time, Europe remained one of the regions with the lowest confidence in vaccines. And this was pre-pandemic. At that point, it was starting to increase, but now we're seeing the situation with COVID-19 in the continent again. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
So Clarissa, we are getting to the end of the time. So.
Perfect. This is my last slide. So if we can just finalize it, great.
Great.
So this is another study that we conducted before there was a vaccine available. And I just want to call your attention to the probably will and probably will not in the middle. So this, you have the people in the extremes, and then I have this mass chunk of people in the middle that could have gone to either side, that could have become, could refuse the vaccine or accept it. So this is just to draw your attention to how important it is to close the gap. If you want any more information about our research, this is our website, and there you're going to find all the resources and all the work that we have been doing. So Thank you very much for your time and for the invitation to speak at this conference.
Thank you very much, Clarissa. So we open now this for questions. I have already a few questions from the audience. The first one is over information on side effects. How much this magnifies vaccine hesitancy?
Yeah, so this is a tricky one because it is very important that there's transparency about the side effects of vaccines, right? So it is very important that healthcare officials and healthcare professionals are clear about what they are, and also clear that every medication, everything you take has risks associated. Even paracetamol is going to have risk associated. But the way that we work is that when we hear about a risk, it kind of comes to the forefront, and that's when it gets a bit irrational. So we think that the fact that risk was mentioned means that it's risky to take it, and not necessarily. So at the same time that it is important to be transparent about that, they shouldn't be concealed. It's important that they're communicated clearly. It's also important to know that it can increase risk perception.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps you can stop sharing the screen so we can see ourselves okay. Next question is, how do inequities in a society impact vaccine hesitancy?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
How inequities, so people with different access to economical access and things like that, how this impact there is an economical aspect, inequity aspect. There are some sectors of the population that are more marginated, that have more or less vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah, so I think it has to do, I mean, it is definitely a big thing, and it has to do with the fact that those populations, many times, they have been marginalized from all public services. So, of course, if you don't have appropriate access to healthcare, how you can't even be blamed for not trusting something that's now being pushed to you at all costs. So many times this mistrust, it can be historic, and it's something that here in the UK we're seeing as a big thing. In the US is also a big thing. So yeah, definitely it does impact how much people trust the public services, including vaccines being available to them.
And next question is specific about SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. Is there a difference between acceptance to SARS-CoV-2 vaccines, the COVID-19 vaccines, versus some other vaccines? Is there some peculiarities for this particular vaccine that is different from the other ones?
Yeah, I think there are many. So first is that vaccine hesitancy is also vaccine specific. So some people might be confident about one vaccine and not another. And that is, of course, the case as well with COVID-19 vaccine. The biggest concern for a long time were the safety of these vaccines, right? Because they were developed in record time, and it was a great thing actually that they were developed in record time. But they raised a lot of anxieties about this vaccine. But again, it is going to be context specific. So it depends on which country we're talking about and which population we're talking about now, but it's definitely still a global challenge to have a rollout that actually encompasses as many people as possible.
Yeah, and I actually have also a question, and that has to do kid vaccination versus adult vaccination. Mm-hmm. I mean, it looks to me that there is even more hesitancy for kid vaccination. So some people that get vaccinated may have doubts about their kids to be vaccinated too. Is this something that has been looking at? How much is this may affect actually when we start to have higher numbers of kids that need to be vaccinated?
You mean in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine specifically?
In terms of the COVID-19, yeah.
COVID-19, yeah. Yeah, I think that maybe perhaps the concerns that were already circulating about adult vaccination of COVID-19, it appears they have skyrocketed now that you have underage people being eligible and needing to take that vaccine, right? And of course, the idea that younger age groups are not at risk of COVID, so why are we exposing them to the risk of this vaccine? Of course, there are concerns that come to play. But again, I think the key thing is to build policy and communication strategies that actually address that. So it's not a bad thing that people have concerns. It is a new vaccine. It hasn't been rolled out to this group. It's only natural that there will be doubts and there will be issues that need to be tackled. It is a challenge, yes, and one that should be addressed the best way possible.
Okay, thanks a lot, Clarissa. And with that, we are going to move to our last speaker of this session, which is going to be Carolyn Reynolds, which is Senior Associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies at the USA. Carolyn, you unmute yourself and share the screen. We can start.
Hello, well, thank you, Adolfo, and let me share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
Okay, everything looks fine. Thanks a lot.
Okay, terrific. Well, thank you so much. And actually, Clarissa's presentation, I think, is a very good segue to mine, because what she ended on was the importance of communications. And I am not a scientist, but I am I've worked my entire career in public policy and advocacy and external relations communications. And what we've seen from this crisis is essentially science can only get us so far. In fact, we need leadership, we need communications, consistent, strong public communications, and you know, in a dynamic crisis such as COVID-19 or any pandemic, it's really about how leadership guides populations through the crisis and navigates that. And that is a little bit of what I'm here to talk about today, but also I was asked to talk about the R&D dimensions of vaccines. So let me click on my slide, excuse me. Okay. So, you know, despite repeated warnings of a deadly pandemic, you know, which had been happening over the course of 2 decades, you know, the world really failed to prioritize and invest in preparedness. We knew this was coming. We just didn't know when exactly it would come. But report after report following major outbreaks over the last 2 decades have really all pointed in the same direction. And certainly those are the emerging lessons from COVID-19, some of which has been talked about previously by Mariano, but that we need globally networked disease surveillance, that we need to invest in, that there's very weak frontline capacity, particularly in low and middle income countries, to detect, prevent, and rapidly respond to outbreaks at the source. That there's been limited data and benefit sharing, and that has contributed to this crisis. Chronic underinvestment in preparedness at local, national, regional, and global levels. And really a failure to plan for and invest in continuing research and development, whether that's manufacturing and supply chain readiness, whether that's vaccines, which we're talking about today, or other life-saving tools, therapeutics, testing, oxygen, PPE. We've seen the real challenges there. And then most importantly, and probably ultimately, it's about weak governance, enforcement, and accountability. And of course, things like vaccine hesitancy, which Clarissa just talked to, are extremely important. So that's actually why we created my organization. I am a fellow at the Center for Strategic International Studies, but actually my day job is that I am co-founder of the Pandemic Action Network, which we created actually last April, just as the pandemic was really beginning to accelerate. And we created it because there have been these, we have seen this repeated cycle of panic and neglect when it comes to pandemics. And we know that outbreaks are inevitable, but pandemics are not. And that it really, what has been this missing link between the science, with the science, is that continued effort on changing public policy and advocating for those changes. And taking the very good research that many scientists and folks in the global health sector have done over many, many years, but turning that into actually political will and action and funding and impact. Sorry. So the organization that I lead now is the Pandemic Action Network, really exists to drive collective action, both to bring an end to this crisis and to prevent the next one. And we have, sorry, my clicker is not working. And this just gives you a snapshot of the 140 plus partners that have joined our network. And actually we're working very closely, including with Clarissa's group at the London School. So let's focus on the issue of vaccines. So we know that this stark imbalance that we see today in vaccine access is really the most, there's been a lot of failures in this response, but this is really the most egregious failure. To date, we have about 7.5 billion COVID vaccine doses that have been administered globally, yet less than 5% of those have gone to low and middle income countries where people have received at least one dose. And of course, it varies across countries. Some are far less than that. And you know, the world stood up some mechanisms and tools. Science moved very quickly, as we've talked about, in record speed to develop these vaccines. But the world actually didn't have a system for figuring out global access. So some tools were stood up. I'll talk about those in a minute, but those have been challenged in their ability to facilitate global equitable access to COVID vaccines. And as of November 2nd, COVAX, which is one of those tools, a partnership between the World Health Organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, CEPI, Gavi, the Vaccines Alliance, and as a partner, delivery partner with UNICEF, as of November 2nd, had delivered about 435 million doses. That actually was a fast acceleration over the last couple of months where they were far behind, and many of you may have seen critical news reports about this. By year's end, they expect to deliver about 800 million to 1 billion doses. That sounds like a lot. It's about half of what they pledged, had predicted at the beginning, and that's still only reaching a fraction of the world's population that needs those vaccines. And so the comparison is that, frankly, in high-income countries, about 10 times greater access and vaccination coverage than in low and middle-income countries. So why is this happening? It's really been a combination of market and systems failures that have driven this inequitable access to COVID-19. There's really structural inequities in our pandemic R&D ecosystem that have hampered the global response, and frankly, are going to, if we don't fix them now, are going to set us up for failure again in terms of preventing or preparing for the next pandemic. And there's been a combination of nationalistic responses that have hampered global COVID R&D and vaccine access efforts. The high-income countries, notably the United States, where I am from, but also in the European Union, invested heavily to de-risk and propel COVID-19 vaccine access and manufacturing, but with provisions that allowed those investor countries first and primary access to those vaccines, and really have put poor nations at the back of the queue. So let's unpack these issues a little bit and these set of failures. So first, there's market failures around chronic underinvestment in global health research and development, especially for emerging infectious diseases that may cause pandemic threats. They often feel like distant and future problems. And both public and private actors have repeatedly failed to prioritize inadequate funding of them. Neglected emerging infectious diseases, which are more typically contained in low and middle income countries, often languish in the vaccine R&D pipeline due to lack of global attention and funding. And there's been, there's limited demand, there's limited profit opportunities that from in the view of the pharmaceutical companies. So that leads to underinvestment across all stages of the vaccine life cycle. And that meant in the case, we were lucky actually, in the case of COVID-19, that there were platforms at the ready, but next time we may not be so lucky because we've really seen these limited boom and bust funding cycles when it comes to R&D. And money flows when there's a crisis, but then it dries up when a crisis dissipates. And you see on this slide here, some of the small fraction of investments in emerging infectious diseases versus overall medical research and development. So often the funding comes far too late, as we've seen in this crisis. We also see the market failures around market risk aversion. And even under normal conditions, we know that vaccine development is very costly and time intensive, with a relatively weak risk reward proposition compared to other business lines in medical R&D. Before COVID, vaccine development from discovery to licensure would typically cost billions of dollars, take over a decade to complete, with an average of 94% chance of failure. So that's a big risk. And the product development, the licensing, the regulatory review, manufacturing, scale up, all of those costs typically, certainly in a non-pandemic situation, are typically borne by industry. And so they have to make investment decisions based on very uncertain demand for their products, especially when disease threats wax and wane. So, and we know pandemics, as we've seen in this one, are very unpredictable, they're dynamic. It makes forecasting that demand very, very difficult. And so that risk reward imbalance means that potentially life-saving vaccines don't get developed, or they're not ready when we need them. There's been a lot of talk about the unprecedented profits that pharmaceutical companies have made in this crisis, and that is very true. But we are talking about a public health crisis, a global public health crisis. And simply put, these are companies that were also built to, many of them have done things such as not-for-profit pricing, et cetera. There's a wide variety across the pharmaceutical industry and how they've responded to this in terms of the global good. Some actors have been better than others. But we simply put, we can't rely on the market in a crisis, because at the end of the day, these are profit-seeking companies. And so we've seen that COVID-19 really exposed these funding and risk aversion failures for emerging infectious disease research and development in real time. It made very clear this need for public funding to come in and de-risk. We know that some companies sat out this and some debated. Although the vaccine development moved quickly, there were a relatively limited number of countries who ended up deciding to jump in the game. We see that the emergency funding that was put in to fuel the development of a number of these leading vaccines, particularly from the US through Operation Warp Speed, but also from the European Union and the UK, really skewed product design and access. So things like the mRNA vaccines, which require, some of which require ultra cold temperatures and cold chain requirements, they were not developed with a view towards low resource settings in low and middle income countries. And as I said earlier, they of course captured the first and vast majority of the supply. So this me first mentality combined and funding, combined with frankly hoarding and overbuying many, many times the number of vaccines that countries needed for their populations, has really undermined the global response and COVAX. So that brings us to the system failures. So we have two organizations, one that was existing and one that was created during COVID-19 to respond to some of these failures. The Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, CEPI, as I mentioned, was actually created after the Ebola crisis and recognition of this problem, that the world needed some kind of standing entity to focus on advancing vaccines that were likely to cause epidemics and potentially pandemics, mostly epidemics, and with a focus on some of these neglected diseases for the global goods. In fact, CEPI played a very critical role, actually, that is not well known early in the COVID crisis. They moved the first investment within I think about 40 days of the identification of the pathogen, the first investment in what became the successful Moderna vaccine. CEPI and CEPI's role in the COVID response, which together with Gavi and WHO created the COVAX pillar, which I'll talk about in a minute, really helped to stimulate some of the early investments in R&D as well as in global manufacturing. CEPI's actually set up as the only public funder of R&D that is purposely looking at equitable access to global vaccines for these kinds of threats. And then we have but it was shortchanged by some of the failures that I just mentioned. So the world stood up the Action for COVID tool, accelerator for COVID tools, and the COVID vaccine pillar really stood up to bring the world together and say, all right, we've got to make sure every country can have access, not just to vaccines, but to diagnostics and other tools. But it's been really challenged. There's been an imbalance of power. They've been at the back of the line from high-income countries, which again have had the corner on the market on doses. And then this is persistent with the effort now to do booster shots in many countries. It's never been fully funded. Essentially, there's been an ongoing fundraising campaign from rich countries to asking for pledges to fill essentially about a $40 billion funding gap, a small fraction of what the pandemic has cost, but that has never been filled. And a new call for resource mobilization is happening. We've seen dose donations, and those have belatedly started to pick up, and many of them are not being delivered on, or they come too close to expiry dates, and then many countries don't want to have them, or there's not enough lead time to figure out delivery. And then of course there have been delivery challenges. But ironically, this problem is solvable. There are, the estimate now from COVAX is that the world needs about $5 billion or about 600 to purchase and deliver about 600 million additional doses to close that gap. So this is obviously not just a inhumane crisis of global vaccine equity, but also it's dangerous for all of us. We know that those as long as we see continued that continued gap in access, we're going to continue to see potential for variants to emerge and for this pandemic to continue to place everyone at risk. So there's really 4 areas of key reforms that we need to see happen, which both in real time can help to start to solve this crisis, but also most importantly to prepare for the next one. And these are around financing, increased forward-looking sustained public sector investments in emerging infectious diseases, research and development, as well as ready surge financing. And with that mindset of what will development from day one for both high income and low income settings. There is a proposal that is being actively discussed now through the G20 and on creating of a new global financing facility that would help to address some of this. There's the issue of essentially pandemic standard operating procedures, where there's streamlined processes that are pre-agreed before a pandemic hits, of industry working with government and regulators to streamline R&D, aligning on R&D needs, on data sharing, on clinical trials, regulatory approvals, some of the things we saw happen during the course of this crisis, but that are not reinvented in crisis time, that are pre-agreed and can be initiated when a pandemic is called. Third is in manufacturing, and really increasing that global footprint for both R&D and manufacturing. And finally, governance and coordination. And some of the key questions that the world really is starting to and needs to battle are, what are the role of, what are the global institutions and networks that we need? Do we need a new pandemic R&D global footprint? And what is the future of these entities and that we've stood up in the course of the crisis? So my last slide.
1 minute left.
Yes.
Carolyn.
So this is my last slide, which is just
Great.
to say, look, there's broad consensus on what the world needs to do. What we lack is the leadership and political will. And I've just included on this slide some quotes from some of both the reports that have come out this year by high-level panels, the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, and the G20 high-level panel, as well as Dr. Tedros of the WHO and the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, essentially all saying the same thing. This is about leadership. We know what to do. It's about the willingness to make some changes in the global governance system, to make the investments are necessary. The consensus is about $15 billion annually, additional in international investment, in addition to increased domestic investment. That's a small price of the trillions that this pandemic has cost. So it's within our power to fix this, but it's whether we have the will to do so. And that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There is one question, but I think you have addressed it at the end already. How can we be better prepared for the future? Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, I think it is this mindset, right? We have to break this cycle of panic and neglect. We for too many, and I would say a couple of things. One is that this mindset, when we have every country has a military, almost every country has a military. And what is the mindset of the military? It's constantly looking out for that next threat. It's constantly being prepared with our troops being prepared, with the intelligence of what threats might come, of having essentially that battle plan ready to go. We need that same mindset for pandemics, and we need it from the highest levels of leadership all the way down to the community level. These threats will come again, and certainly they will come again and be potentially even worse if we don't prepare for them. But there are things we can do that we've learned in the past and we've learned during this pandemic that will mitigate those threats. Even as we are waiting potentially for the development of a novel vaccine. There are public health behaviors. There's again, investments in the ability of people to do things like, stay locked down in their house, but not sacrifice their livelihoods to do so. The adjustments of, education. This needs to be embedded in the core DNA of every sector, of every business, of every community, of every country. So every country needs a plan. Every country needs to invest that plan, and it needs to be a constant vigilance that we have.
Yeah, I have a question that is, it goes, it's a little bit different, but has also to do with problems that they may associate with vaccination. So understanding that the most important thing is to get vaccination to everywhere. What are the consequences, especially with respect to motility, that some countries, Europe and the United States, they start to get vaccination required in order to move around, but they only accept the vaccines that have been approved by the EMA and the FDA. And how much this can affect actually, and how this problem may be solved, because someone is vaccinated with a Sputnik or with a Chinese vaccine and wants to move to Europe. How much of this is going to be a problem, and how this could be solved?
Well, it goes to why we have to solve this as a global community. This is a pandemic is a global public bad, and we need a global public good in terms of a governance structure and agreement that are going to try to avoid this situation. We are in it now for COVID. So I think I don't have the ready solution right now, other than that, to accelerate vaccine access around the world, and to bring the threat to, there's a very good chance that we will not be rid of COVID, but if it becomes endemic or something that is, then there are ways that the world has dealt with that, whether it's yellow fever or other things. So this is going to be an evolving threat, but it does speak to the issue of having, if you will, a global governance and agreement. In 2 weeks, the World Health Assembly is going to meet in special session to talk about a pandemic treaty. And essentially that's the starting conversation for a global agreement or framework about data sharing, about benefit sharing, but that would also help to guide some of these decisions about travel and trade and et cetera. But it is because we're going to have to figure out to live as a global community with these threats.
Yeah, so thanks a lot. I think we are very close to the end. So I want to thank the speakers, great talks. Thanks also to the audience for the questions. And with that, I'm gonna close this session, but remind everybody that we are gonna start in 2 minutes a round table in the next session that will be moderated by Denise Nanish and Julia Blanco. And please stay with us for the next session for those that are interested in these discussions. Thanks a lot to everybody again, and especially to the speakers. They have been great getting on time, despite some of the technical difficulties that happened in the first 2 talks. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Ciao.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.